In this video, we'll explore the events that occurred in Austin, Texas. 43-year-old Diane Holik was a successful woman who held a senior position at IBM. On the morning of November 16, 2001, she missed a scheduled work call, which immediately caused concern for her colleagues because everyone knew her as a responsible person. Hence, when colleagues could not reach her, they contacted the police and asked to check Diane's house. Arriving there, the officers made a terrible discovery. Diane Tammy Holik was born in 1958 in New York City. Friends and family described her as a workaholic and a joyful person. Her determination and work performance made her a financially secure person. For more than 20 years, she has worked at IBM, one of the world's largest manufacturers and suppliers of hardware and software. In 1996, she moved to Austin, Texas. By this time, she held a senior position in the company, which allowed her to work from her home office. Diane bought a luxury house in the suburbs of Austin and lived a life that many can only dream of. She organized wine tasting parties for friends, visited the most expensive restaurants and dance clubs, and was engaged in charity work. At the same time, she tried to improve her personal life. In mid-November of 2001, a storm warning was in effect in Texas. Torrential rains and tornadoes hit Austin, so Diane worked from her home. On the morning of November 16th, her company scheduled a work call, but she stopped answering her phone. Diane had several phones, including her home phone. However, she didn't answer any of them. Her colleagues left messages asking her to call back. Somehow, they quickly realized something was wrong. Hence, they contacted the police department and asked them to send someone to Diane's house to check if anything had happened. When the officers arrived at the house, Diane's neighbor noticed them and said she had a spare key. The police went inside, where there was complete silence, broken only by dogs coming out of the kitchen. Having received no response from Diane, they began to inspect the house. In the bedroom on the second floor, they found the lifeless body of Diane Holik. Detectives went to her house. Diane's home became one of the cleanest crime scenes they had to deal with. There were no signs of theft, struggle, or illegal entry into the house. Diane's body, fully dressed, was lying in the bedroom next to her bed. And yet, the detectives quickly realized they were dealing with a crime. There were distinct strangulation marks on the woman's neck, left by something like a rope. Also, there were traces of someone binding her wrists with, presumably, cable ties. The cleanliness in the house, untouched valuables, and the absence of signs of forced entry led detectives to believe that Diane died at the hands of a person she knew. They thought it was someone she trusted enough to let into the house. There were no signs of someone forcing her into intimacy before death. However, the detectives found several dark spots and red stains on the carpet before the bedroom entrance. The only thing that caught the detectives' eyes was a towel lying on the back of the sofa in the living room, because it did not fit into the overall picture of cleanliness and order. Therefore, they sent it to the laboratory for examination. The police interviewed the people who knew Diane and learned she had no enemies, or perhaps no one knew about them. They also discovered she was in a relationship with Dennis Conley. The latter was the man with whom Diane wanted to spend her future life. She was already married before, but that marriage quickly ended. Diane and Dennis met through a dating service. He had 2 children from a previous marriage and was a businessman. Dennis lived in Houston, about 150 miles from Austin, where Diane lived. Despite the distance and infrequent meetings, they quickly became close. After 2 months of communication, Dennis proposed to Diane, giving her a platinum ring worth $17,500. The woman said, yes. Diane's close friends told investigators her relationship with Dennis began to deteriorate recently. She was an independent woman who devoted her life to building a career, while Dennis sometimes tried to control her. Another thing that bothered Diane was the decision to move to Houston. She and Dennis decided to start a life together on his territory, so Diane put her house in the suburbs of Austin up for sale. However, realtors could not find anyone willing to pay $435,000 for the property. Detectives started wondering if Dennis was involved in Diane's death. They asked him to come to the police station, and he agreed to a frank conversation without a lawyer. The medical examiner concluded that Diane died between 3 p.m. on November 15th and 3 a.m. on November 16th. However, there was another interesting detail. The wedding ring Dennis gave her was not on her finger, but her other jewelry remained untouched in the bedroom. Perhaps the perpetrator had personal reasons, or maybe the criminal removed the ring from the victim's hand to confuse investigators. During the interview, Dennis gave the impression of a grief-stricken man. They asked him about his relationship with Diane and his whereabouts on the day of his fiance's death and the day they found her body. He said he was in Houston at the time. On Thursday morning, November 15th, he and Diane talked on the phone. He spent the whole day at work and did not contact her again. The next morning, Dennis was unable to reach Diane. Hence, he left a message on her voicemail. As we now know, the woman was already dead by this time. He admitted that their relationship was far from ideal, mentioning they had arguments lately. Before ending the conversation, the police took his fingerprints and a DNA sample. Theoretically, he could come to Austin, deal with Diane, and return to Houston by morning. However, the detectives checked his alibi. The man didn't leave the city, hence the police had to look for a new suspect. And Dennis was the one who changed the course of the investigation. Before leaving the police station, he said that one of Diane's colleagues paid too much attention to her. As detectives established, Ray, the man Dennis mentioned, periodically visited Diane's house and sometimes even walked her dogs. But Ray also had a solid alibi and was not considered a suspect. However, when talking with Diane's colleagues, the authorities learned that some man inspected her house a few days before her death. He sold the ranch and planned to buy her home if he liked it after inspection. He said he would make a cash offer. This man inspected the house and said he would return with his wife in a few days to make a joint decision on the purchase. Since this information was one of the few clues the police had, they directed all their efforts to find this mysterious buyer. Perhaps someone saw him when he came to see Diane's house. Detectives started interviewing the owners of all the properties for sale in the area where Diane lived, suggesting that the victim's house wasn't the only one this mysterious buyer came to see. Of all the people interviewed, 7 women told the same story. According to them, on the day of Diane's death, a 45-45-year-old man with a big nose and dark hair combed back came to see their houses without the presence of a real estate agent. While 6 women didn't let the man in, one still allowed him to go inside and see the house. As this woman said, the potential buyer behaved strangely after going inside. He didn't open any doors or look at the arrangement of the rooms. He was only interested in the bedroom on the 2nd floor, asking the woman to show it to him. The woman felt something was wrong and asked him to leave her home. The important thing here is that this man introduced himself as Walter Miller when asking for permission to inspect the house. The police searched for this name in their databases while a forensic artist sketched this man. There were 2 Walter Millers in Austin, none of which fit either age or appearance description. Detectives were trying to understand the motive of the crime. Did the criminal only take the wedding ring? Could he have taken other jewelry or money? After all, the victim was wealthy and lived alone for a long time. Hence, no one could tell how much jewelry she actually had. Why did he take off the cable ties that bound Diane's hands and take them with him? Did he know her? When the police found Diane's body, she was fully clothed, and the autopsy found no evidence of someone forcing her into intimacy before her death. Yet, the detectives decided to return to her home and look for traces of semen, assuming the criminal could have left the fluid somewhere in the house, but they didn't find anything there. The sketch of a possible criminal started appearing on the evening newscasts that asked anyone who knew a similar person to report it. One of the few clues available to the police was a few short hairs found on a towel from Diane's house. Unfortunately, this hair was without roots, which prevented the experts from getting a complete DNA sample of their owner. Nevertheless, the investigators had high hopes for the results of the partial profile. Meanwhile, a woman called the police after seeing a sketch of a man reasonably considered a suspect in the Diane Holik case. During the interview with detectives, the caller said she and her husband put their house up for sale about 6 months ago. One afternoon, a man came and said he wanted to buy a house for cash. However, he needed to see it first. As in the previous stories, a real estate agent wasn't there. This woman did not let the stranger into her home, so he had to leave. After about 2 months, she saw the same man on the doorstep. The latter introduced himself as Jim Taylor. Her husband had just left for work, and she was at home with her little daughter. The man again asked to look around inside, but was refused. It angered him. He started shouting and insisting on going inside. The pseudo-buyer only left when the woman said she would call the police. The woman was terrified. She took a piece of paper and wrote down his name and the license plate number of his minivan, parked in the driveway. When she saw the suspect's portrait on the news, she felt he was the one who came to look at her house back then. Thus, the police now had the license plate number at their disposal. Using the database, they learned that the vehicle's owner was not Jim Taylor, but Patrick Anthony Russo. At first glance, it seemed unlikely that Russo was involved in Diane's death. He lived 40 minutes from Austin, was married, raised 2 children, and played in a church music band. But a more detailed analysis of his past showed the man was an ex-convict who served time for a series of attacks on women. One of them ended with abduction. He tied up his victim with cable ties and started strangling, but stopped at the last moment. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison for this crime. While behind bars, he met his future wife, Janet, a church volunteer. Despite his criminal record, Russo was released from prison on parole, having served 8 years out of 20. The police didn't believe it was a coincidence, so they went to Anthony Russo's house after receiving a search warrant. Giving the impression of a man who was not at all surprised by the visit of the police, Anthony opened the door. But the police found no evidence in his house. Diane's ring or any of her other belongings weren't there. A search of his minivan didn't bring any results either. But what was important is that the neighbors saw a similar car at Diane's house on the day of her death. In the utility room, they found several cable ties identical to those that left marks on Diane's wrists. However, even if we consider it as evidence, it's still an indirect one. After all, anyone can buy these ties at any hardware store. The investigator informed Anthony that his name had come up during the investigation of one of the cases and asked him to go to the station for a more detailed conversation. There, they asked Russo about his whereabouts on November 15th and 16th. He said that on Thursday the 15th, he went to Austin to a religious radio station but could not get there because no one opened the door for him. It just so happened that this radio station was not far from Diane Holik's house. According to him, he went home at about 4 p.m. but got a little lost due to a hurricane. Hence, he arrived home around 6 p.m. I want to remind you that according to the report of the forensic medical expert, Diane died between 3 p.m. and 3 a.m. When the police asked Russo if he was looking for a house to buy, he replied he had never looked at any properties for sale. It is a crucial moment because his statement will have consequences. When they showed him a picture of Diane, he did not react in any way and said he never met her. There was no evidence to link him to the crime, so the police had to let him go. But the next day, when the detectives visited the radio station that Russo was talking about, it became clear that his words about the closed doors were lies. The employees said they didn't close the doors because many people gathered in the lobby due to the approaching tornado. Meanwhile, another woman contacted the police. She was also selling a house and came across a man who looked similar to the suspect's sketch. The young mother was at home with her child when someone knocked on her door. When she opened it, she saw a man holding a pamphlet. The pamphlet contained house-selling ads, including her own. The stranger said he wanted to buy a house and asked permission to go inside and look around, mentioning he would make a cash offer. This woman let him in. However, he tried to attack her when she showed him one of the bedrooms, but then he heard a child crying in the next room and quickly left. The woman kept the pamphlet that this man was holding in his hands. When the police received it, they found a well-preserved fingerprint on it. Those fingerprints belonged to Anthony Russo, but he claimed he had never looked at the houses for sale. The new evidence meant he gave a false statement. He was still on probation, and having lied to the police, he committed a misdemeanor. Russo's failure to fulfill the parole conditions was the reason for his arrest. The authorities were afraid he would run away while they were looking for evidence that could link him to Diane's death. They thought it would be safer to keep him behind bars. The police managed to find 15 women to whom Russo came to see the houses. All these women came to identify the suspect. On the other side of the glass were 5 equally dressed and similar men, one of whom was Anthony Russo. All of those men repeated specific phrases in turn.
Repeat the following phrase. You have a beautiful house. You have a beautiful house.
10 of the 15 women identified Anthony Russo as the person who came to them to see the house before buying. The other 5 failed to identify anyone. The police again interrogated Russo, but now he knew they revealed his lies. However, it did not prevent him from declaring his innocence. At some point, he said he wanted to see his wife and stopped answering questions. Soon after, the detectives received a report from the laboratory. It confirmed that the mitochondrial sequence of the hair found on the towel from Diane's house matches Anthony Russo's DNA. However, it was only partial evidence, leaving a slight chance that the hair could belong to someone else. According to court documents, the probability that someone else would have the same DNA profile as Russo was 1 in 12,900,000. Thus, the investigation had a lot of indirect evidence, but there was not a single direct clue linking Russo with the death of Diane Holik. Another indirect proof was the report on the location of his cell phone that established Russo was in the same area where Diane lived on the day of her death. After examining the computer seized from his house, the experts found a very revealing search history. Russo, a 37-year-old man with 2 children and a regular visitor to the church, was a frequent user of the adult website. There, he watched videos and read articles about strangulation during intimacy. The materials on the website weren't free. What is even more revealing is that a couple of days before Diane's death, he read a story where a male character enters the house of a lonely woman under the guise of a buyer, strangles her, and takes valuables with him when he leaves, so that everyone thinks that the motive was robbery and not a desire to quench his thirst for strangulation. The detectives thoroughly studied the financial side of the life of Russo and his wife. Having around $2,000 in savings, he could not afford to buy a new home. In addition, he and his wife have not yet paid the bank for the house in which they lived. Although they had no direct evidence, the police charged Anthony Russo with taking the life of Diane Holik. On February 5, 2004, more than 2 years after Diane's death, he appeared in court. 14 women testified under oath, stating Russo approached them about buying a house. He visited some of them on the day of Diane's death, but they wouldn't let him into their homes. The exception was one woman who first let him in and then quickly told him to leave because of his strange behavior. Everyone Russo came to was about the same age. It indicated that he was watching the owners before knocking on their doors. He was interested in women of a specific type. The prosecution presented all the evidence previously mentioned in the video and described the alleged events on that ill-fated November day. As mentioned before, Diane told one of her colleagues that a potential buyer had come to her to see the house. Prosecutors suggested that Russo realized Diane lived alone after the first time he saw the house. On November 15th, Russo toured the homes for sale, but only one woman let him inside. But then, he came to Diane's house. Russo probably asked Diane to show him the house again, and yet he went there with a specific purpose and thought out all his actions, trying not to leave any traces. It was raining outside, so Diane unexpectedly gave him a towel to wipe his hands and face. He casually threw this towel on the back of the sofa. She again showed him the house. When they were on the second floor, Russo attacked her. Prosecutors believed that Russo enjoyed the process of strangulation, which led to Diane not surviving the second meeting with him. Before leaving, Russo took cable ties and Diane's wedding ring, which the police could not find. He locked the door with a spare key stored at the front door. It was the version of the prosecutor's office. Russo's former and current wives also spoke at the trial. They both said that Anthony enjoyed the strangulation process. It is worth remembering that the man's first conviction was for a similar crime. After an 11-hour discussion, the jury found Patrick Anthony Russo guilty. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment, but he never admitted his guilt. Despite his criminal history, Russo will again be eligible for parole. He can file his first petition in 2044. By that time, he will be a little over 80 years old. In today's episode, we'll discuss the events that occurred in 2008 in Iowa, US. When the detectives arrived at the scene, they thought it was an ordinary car accident, but soon this case proved them wrong. The police solved the mysterious death of 41-year-old Michelle Davis thanks to the CCTV footage, which helped to find out what really happened and who was behind it. Michelle Ann Cosner was born on December 15, 1966, in Iowa. In 2008, the 41-year-old woman lived in Des Moines and had 3 children. She was on the threshold of a new stage in her life. The court almost finalized her divorce papers. Michelle was looking forward to starting a new life. She has already moved into a separate apartment and filed a restraining order against her husband, Randy Davis. The family had an uneasy relationship in the years leading up to the divorce. People describe Michelle as a friendly, active person who loved adventures and motorcycles. She worked as a secretary for a trucking company and enjoyed respect and authority in the workplace. On Thursday, September 11, 2008, Michelle was at work. Colleagues noticed that after parting with her husband, she looked like she got rid of a burden weighing her down for many years. On this day, Michelle was in a good mood and left work around 4:30 p.m., having finished all her business. Shortly after that, the 911 began receiving calls from eyewitnesses who informed the operator about an accident on Interstate 235. The Mercury Sable car was upside down with a woman still wearing a seatbelt in the driver's seat. She was unconscious. Unfortunately, paramedics who arrived at the scene couldn't save her. The deceased woman's name was Michelle Davis. After arriving at the scene, the police decided that Michelle lost control of the vehicle, which resulted in an accident. However, the very next day, they excluded this version. The forensic experts concluded that Michelle did not die from hitting her head during the rollover. The cause of her death was a bullet wound to the head. They extracted the bullet and sent it for examination, hoping it would help to find the criminal. The investigators assigned to this case had never encountered such a thing before. While waiting for the results of the ballistic examination, the local authorities decided to ensure the safety of the people on the street. After all, what if Michelle was a random victim, not chosen in advance? What if there was a shooter that wouldn't stop at one victim? The number of cars that drive on this interstate is large, and each driver could be a potential target for the distraught shooter. It was crucial to solve this case as soon as possible. Hence, the police started patrolling the city more often. When it became clear that Michelle's death was not accidental, detectives went to the crime scene, hoping to understand where the shooter could be and whether he left any traces. And yet it didn't bring any results. They found neither the cartridge case nor any other evidence that could help the investigation. Moreover, since the police initially assumed that Michelle was the victim of a car accident, the traffic services cleared the site. Hence, even if there was any evidence, it was irretrievably destroyed. But despite all this, the detectives did not despair and hoped to get some answers by reviewing the recordings from traffic cameras. Nowadays, CCTV cameras often help the police to solve various cases, and this case was no exception. Having the recordings from the traffic cameras at their disposal, the investigators immediately began to study them. First, they needed to find the recording from the camera closest to the crime scene and rewind it to when people started calling 911. Half an hour later, the investigators found what they were looking for. The video showed Michelle's car lying upside down. However, the quality of the footage wasn't good, so the video was more like a slideshow in the form of separate alternating pictures with intervals between them. As a result, the investigators had only a few necessary shots, none of which showed what led to the rollover of Michelle's car. It was an unpleasant development because the investigators were sure they already had the necessary clue, but unfortunately, it was a false hope. All that remained for the police to do was to continue checking the remaining camera recordings and look for possible eyewitnesses. While the police team continued to study the recordings from other traffic cameras, the investigator assigned to the Michelle Davis case went to her family to inform them that her death was not an accident, as initially assumed. Hearing that Michelle was the victim of a crime put her family in shock. Michelle's mother, Patty, died long before Michelle's life ended. As for her father, Michael Lee Cosner, it was the loss of his second daughter. His first daughter and Michelle's older sister, Cheryl Sue Cosner, died in 1965 when she was around 1 year old. And now, 43 years later, Michael Cosner has lost another child. Outliving the children is the worst thing parents can go through. Michelle's family told the investigator her life was gradually changing, mentioning she had no financial problems. However, the family believed that the only person who could harm Michelle was her husband, Randy Davis. After all, the court almost finalized their divorce, and she filed a restraining order against him. At the same time, another detective visited the company where Michelle worked to talk to her colleagues. That's how the investigators learned that Michelle had a close relationship with another man after breaking up with her husband. This man's name was Matt Jorgensen, and he was her colleague. According to Michelle's friend, the feelings between this couple were mutual. However, since Michelle was in the process of divorcing Randy Davis, they decided to keep their relationship a secret, so only some colleagues and close friends knew about it. Hence, the police now had two potential suspects, Randy Davis and Matt Jorgensen. Attempts to contact Randy were unsuccessful. All calls went straight to voicemail. As for Matt, the investigators met with him to ask questions about his whereabouts on the day of Michelle's death. He did not hide anything, admitting he and Michelle had a romantic relationship. As he said, they never argued or had fights. The man was shocked by Michelle's death, so he told every detail of what he was doing on the day she died. His alibi checked out, and the police excluded him from the list of suspects. When the results of the ballistic examination came, it became known that the weapon of the crime was a .22 caliber rifle. Experts concluded it was a close-range shot. Moreover, since everything happened while driving on the interstate, the police believed the shooter was most likely in another car that drove next to Michelle's car. At the same time, this case had a new suspect. The police received a call from the insurance company and reported that Michelle's brother Todd was claiming payment under her life insurance. Crimes committed with the motive to receive money under life insurance are not unusual, but was this case one of them? Could Todd have taken his sister's life to get this payout? The detective went to his house to ask some questions. When he started interrogating Todd about where he was when Michelle died, the latter realized the police considered him a suspect. He told everything he was doing on the day of his sister's death. Todd said their family was in a difficult financial situation and could not organize a decent funeral for Michelle. Thus, he turned to the insurance company because he needed the money for Michelle's funeral. The police checked Todd's alibi and learned that he was in another part of the city at the time of Michelle's death. Hence, Todd wasn't the one who shot her. However, Todd still gave the police information that allowed them to find another suspect, Michelle's stepson, Josh. When Michelle married Randy, he already had a son from a previous marriage. At the time of Michelle's death, Josh was already an adult. He was a Marine who returned home from the Army shortly before someone fatally wounded Michelle on the road. Josh knew how to handle weapons, which made him one of the suspects. The police started analyzing whether Josh had motives for committing this crime. Meanwhile, the police received another clue. A woman reported that she was driving on Interstate 235 on the same day and at the same time when Michelle's car rolled over. According to the caller, she saw a red pickup truck, presumably a Ford F-150, whose driver behaved strangely, swerving from one lane to another. It gave the impression that he was chasing someone. The woman described the driver as an adult white man in a baseball cap, and that's all she could see. This new information seemed important, so the investigators started checking it. They again turned to footage from the traffic cameras, but now they focused on finding whether there was a red pickup truck nearby. And the woman was right. The footage showed a red pickup truck following Michelle right from her place of work. But again, the quality of the footage prevented the police from seeing the driver's face and the license plates of the red pickup truck. After reviewing the recordings from other cameras, investigators concluded the red pickup truck was driving along the same route as Michelle, following her every move. It was hardly a coincidence. Moreover, when Michelle was approaching the place of her death, the pickup truck was very close behind her. This information suggested that the criminal fired his decisive shot while driving. With several suspects in mind, detectives quickly discovered that Michelle's husband, Randy Davis, owned a red pickup truck. Detectives immediately went to his house. Randy was not at home, but his son Josh was there. He was a Marine who knew how to handle weapons professionally and could have access to his father's car. Josh told detectives that on the day of Michelle's death, he and his sister went shopping, after which he returned home and spent the evening watching TV. He said that Michelle's divorce from his father was an arduous process because, among other things, she wanted to get half the house value. Josh also said his father came home around 5:30 p.m. that day. Josh's story didn't look convincing. Moreover, this conversation made it clear that he could have a motive for committing the crime. Josh was very displeased that his stepmom decided to take part of his estate from him during the divorce process with his father. But these were just assumptions without any physical evidence, and no evidence means no arrest and no charges. While Michelle's family prepared for the funeral, the police searched for new leads. The police began to go around all the shops and gas stations along the route from her place of work to where she died, hoping to find additional surveillance footage. A few miles from the trucking company where she worked, there was a store where the police found another footage crucial to the investigation. While the surveillance camera was inside the store, it still captured part of the parking lot. On September 11, 2008, the day Michelle died, a red pickup truck drove to the store and parked at the entrance at about 4 p.m. The police knew the pickup truck belonged to Randy Davis, but since his son Josh also had access to it, they needed to find out which one was driving it that day. The footage showed the driver exiting the car and entering the store. However, due to the poor quality of the video, investigators couldn't determine whether it was Josh Davis or his father, Randy. At some point, the man disappeared from the camera's field of view, but after a while, he reappeared, purchased something, and left the store. Then he got into his car and drove away. I want to remind you that all this happened at 4 p.m., while Michelle left work at 4:30 p.m. The police continued analyzing the footage and found that over the next 30 minutes, the pickup truck returned to the store several times. However, the driver did not exit the car, but turned around and drove away again. The last time the pickup truck appeared near the store was when Michelle left work. Unable to identify the suspect, the police again tried to contact Michelle's husband, Randy Davis. The latter finally got in touch and showed up at the police station. The investigators explained to him his rights, clarifying he was not under arrest. Randy agreed to answer some questions. They asked what he was doing on September 11th. Randy mentioned going through the arduous divorce procedure with Michelle. After all, they were married for 17 years. He also said he worked as a carpenter and was at work that day. When asked when he got home, Randy hesitated, but later said he was home at 3:45 p.m. It contradicted the surveillance footage and did not correspond to the testimony of Josh, who said that his father came home around 5:30 p.m. Randy said he didn't leave home after 3:45 p.m. He stated he was home alone, but then his son Josh came, and they cooked dinner together. This information again contradicted Josh's testimony, who told investigators he was already home when his father came. The alibis of the father and son depended on each other, and after talking with Randy, the investigators realized that one of them was lying. To see Randy's reaction, investigators informed him that Michelle died from a bullet, not from injuries sustained during a car crash. After all, the only people who knew about it were Michelle's family, because the police did not disclose this information. Randy practically didn't react to this news in any way, simply pretending to be surprised and lowering his eyes. After the police asked him when he had last seen Michelle, Randy demanded a lawyer. Thus, the conversation was over. The investigation had neither the weapon used to take Michelle's life nor any other significant evidence that could serve as a basis for arrest, so they had to release him. On September 15, 2008, 4 days after Michelle's death, her family and friends gathered for a funeral ceremony. Randy Davis was also among those who came to say goodbye to Michelle. With his whole appearance, he tried to show that what had happened was a heavy loss for him. He even burst into tears at some point. But who was responsible for the death of Michelle Davis? The investigators did everything possible to answer this question quickly. Help came from where no one expected. Josh Davis entered the police station with his lawyer and said he wanted to make a statement. According to his statement, his father's car was parked in the driveway when he returned home from his sister. He entered the house and saw his father there with a gun in his hands. Randy told his son it would be better if he didn't come now. According to Josh, he understood what his father was up to. He tried to stop him, begging him not to do things he would regret later. But Randy still got in the car and drove away. When he returned, he drove the car into the garage. Josh went to the garage, where his father confessed that he had shot Michelle. Randy Davis was upset that his wife filed for divorce and decided to sue him for part of the property. He could not accept this and decided to take drastic measures. On September 11, 2008, Randy parked his red pickup truck outside the store and waited for Michelle to leave work. He drove past the place where Michelle worked several times, afraid to miss the moment. It explained why Randy appeared on the store's CCTV footage several times. After Michelle left work, he followed her. When the right moment came, he rolled down the passenger side window and fired. Based on Josh's testimony, the police arrested Randy Davis. He received the first-degree charges for taking the life of Michelle. However, before going to trial, Randy signed a deal, pleading guilty to second-degree deprivation of life in exchange for a milder sentence. Based on this, 53-year-old Randy Davis was sentenced to 50 years in prison in 2010. His guilty plea means there won't be a trial. By not having a trial, maybe we missed justice a little bit, but we did get what we wanted. We knew he did it, and he admitted that he did it, says Michelle's brother Todd Cosner. He said Davis had destroyed their family. I loved Randy. He was part of my family for 17 years. I cared about him, said Todd Cosner. In this video, we'll discuss the events that occurred in Hawaii. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve 1991, 23-year-old Dana Ireland left her parents' house in Puna but never returned. After discovering her disfigured bicycle, shoe, and hair clumps, bystanders called 911. However, Dana wasn't there. The investigation dragged on for several decades, and although there was the trial and the verdict, the case hasn't been closed. The evolution of DNA testing methods played a crucial role in this case. Dana Ireland's story is probably the most high-profile investigation in the history of Hawaii. Dana Marie Ireland was born on December 12, 1968, in Fort Belvoir, Fairfax County, Virginia, USA. She was the youngest daughter in the family of John Ireland and Mary Louise Crank. Her sister Sandra was 7 years older than her. In 1991, when Dana was 23 years old, she and her parents were visiting her sister, who lived in Hawaii. On December 24th in the afternoon, she took her sister's bike for a ride. Later, people found her bike, shoe, and clump of hair next to the side of the road. But Dana herself was not there. From the bike's appearance, it was clear that Dana got hit by a car. The impact was so strong that it deformed both wheels and the steering wheel, and the seat came off altogether. Unfortunately, the hope that the man who hit Dana took her to the hospital instead of leaving her to die was false. The reality turned out to be much scarier than anyone could have imagined. Dana was found 5 miles from where they found her bike. She had severe injuries on her body and head and was naked from the waist down. Hence, one can conclude that someone didn't just hit her with a car, someone also took advantage of her weakness. Nightmares haunt nurse Jerry Gallagher. She can't escape the memory of Christmas Eve 1991 at a spot on a seaside fishing trail in Wawa, where she was led to Dana, Ireland. Gallagher lived with her husband Randy on Saddleick Road, a rough, unpaved road cutting into the coastal jungle 25 miles by road southeast of Hilo. At 6 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1991, a friend named Brian knocked on their door to call Gallagher, a licensed nurse. He wore a Christmas hat with blinking lights, but his mood was far from festive. He drove her to where Dana was lying, a mile from Gallagher's house. Dana was naked from the waist down, and the inner side of her legs was full of bruises. Gallagher remembers trying to help the injured young woman. Using a first aid kit, she bandaged her wounds. The most severe injury was on the back of her head. She asked the woman her name. "Island," she seemed to say. Gallagher asked who attacked her, but Dana wasn't coherent. "Please give me the keys so I can drive home," Ireland said. Gallagher tried to keep her awake. An ambulance arrived more than 2 hours after the girl got hit by a car. The lack of phones in the area led to a significant delay in getting help. The medical staff of the police and fire departments were busy with other cases. However, their own mistakes also led to a 34-minute delay. The dispatcher who received the call about the injured young woman gave the wrong address of where they found Dana, which caused a loss of valuable time. "I thought 1,000,000 times about taking her down to the hospital in my car, but I was so concerned about paralyzing her," Gallagher says. "I've had nightmares about it. None of us knew that it was going to take so long. It took an indescribably long time to get help down to her. If they had got help to her, she would have lived." An ambulance with Dana, Ireland inside arrived at Hilo Hospital at 7:56 p.m. At this time, John and Mary Ireland were already looking for their daughter, whose disfigured bicycle lay by the side of the road. They heard the news about an injured woman found 5 miles away. However, they didn't know that this woman was Dana. "We thought someone had hit her and taken her to the hospital," Mary recalled later. John told Mary and his eldest daughter Sandra to go to the hospital while he stayed near Dana's bike. When the ambulance brought Dana to the hospital, her mother and older sister were already there. Doctors fought for Dana's life for 4.5 hours, but unfortunately, they could not save her. She was pronounced dead at 12:25 a.m. The official cause of death was blood loss due to extensive traumatic injuries of head, pelvis, and abdomen, caused by a motor vehicle accident. Dana's family went home and heard the radio the following morning. They thought some car hit their daughter, but the radio said Dana's death wasn't accidental. When John spoke to a local police representative, he was told nothing about the fact that not only had Dana been hit by a car, but that someone had taken advantage of her vulnerability afterward. He had asked a police lieutenant if the attack was deliberate. "You're listening to rumors," the lieutenant told him. Dana's death came as a shock to her family. Her death irreversibly changed their lives. However, they would later realize another challenge awaited them: many years of searching for suspects and trials. The police launched an investigation, which the local newspapers described as intense. The police found a T-shirt that belonged to the criminal at the crime scene. Next, investigators seized as evidence a sheet with traces of semen on which Dana was lying when brought to the hospital. Seminal fluid was also on Dana's body. Moreover, a bite mark on her body was a potential clue, since it looked like the teeth prints of the person who attacked her. As a result, the authorities had a DNA sample of the criminal at their disposal. But it was 1991. It wasn't of much help to the investigation process. Another potential clue was the tire tracks where they found Dana's bike. Investigators interviewed residents, hoping to find witnesses who saw Dana getting hit by a car, but no one saw this moment. Or perhaps, for some reason, they remained silent. The place where the bike was found and the place where Dana was found was not a densely populated area, but instead was a secluded place with a bad road where cars didn't travel very often. Due to the lack of witnesses and evidence to help find the criminal, the investigation has reached a dead end. Anyone with information about the case would have received a reward, the amount of which grew over time. However, there was no breakthrough in the case. Later, in May 1994, John Gonsalves contacted the Hawaii County Police. Gonsalves was involved in a high-profile case involving illegal substances, but even though he was facing several decades in prison, he got off with a suspended sentence. The reason for such mitigation was that he told the police that his half-brother, Frank Pauline, had important information about the Dana Ireland case. Pauline said that brothers Albert Ian Schweitzer and Sean Schweitzer were involved in the attack on Dana. The Schweitzer family lived next door to the Pauline family, and the two did not get along with one another. Frank Pauline claimed he was there when Schweitzers attacked Dana. They ran over Dana Ireland, put her in the trunk, and took her to another place, he told the police. Hence, the police made Albert Schweitzer, Sean Schweitzer, and Frank Pauline the main suspects. After the latter's statements, there was a 30-year series of events. Therefore, to understand who Frank Pauline is, let's get to know him better. Frank Raymond Pauline Jr. was born on April 27, 1973, in Fremont, California, in the family of Frank Sr. and Patricia Pauline. At the time of the attack on Dana Ireland, Pauline lived in Puna, a few miles from where they found her. At the age of 20, Frank was already the father of 3 sons. He had his first problems with the law at the age of 9. On February 8, 1983, he got caught in a burglary. You can see his entire track record up to his maturity on your screen. The older he got, the more serious the crimes he committed became. In February 1994, a little over 2 years after Dana's death, he was sentenced to 10 years for harassment and robbery. These charges were not related to Dana Ireland, and yet it made it clear that Frank Pauline won't stop his criminal activities. Due to the crime's multitude, prosecutors dubbed him a walking crime wave at the sentencing hearing. After the hearing, Pauline lived up to his new nickname. He walked out of the courtroom before he was taken into custody to start his prison term. Classified as a fugitive, he was recaptured in Honolulu a few days later. 3 months after Pauline received a 10-year sentence, his brother John Gonsalves contacted the authorities and told them that Frank had information about the Dana Ireland case. Pauline and Gonsalves decided that providing information on the Ireland case would help the first one not to go to prison and the second to get out of it earlier. Of course, the stepbrothers were doubtful sources of information. And yet, after a conversation with investigators, the case against John Gonsalves for illegal substances was closed. In the end, he received only a suspended sentence. After Pauline stated he had information about the Dana Ireland case, investigators from Big Island went to talk with Pauline in Honolulu, where the latter was in custody. It was a 90-minute interrogation, during which they asked to tell the details about the day of the attack on Dana. Since he claimed to be present during the attack, they took him back to the Big Island, where he reconstructed the crime and showed detectives the places he mentioned earlier. Pauline told detectives that brothers Albert Ian and Sean Schweitzers picked him up in a purple Volkswagen Beetle at his home on December 24, 1991. As he said, Ian Schweitzer was behind the wheel. The trio stopped to take illegal substances before they saw a woman standing on the side of the road. We came out by an intersection going towards Kapoho, and that's where we saw a girl standing up. As we were going past, my friend Ian looked towards the side, and he said, "Ho, look at that girl." Then we continued to go forward down the road. Pauline said they turned around because Ian wanted to talk to the woman. They were driving back at about 45 miles per hour, and Ian Schweitzer, who was behind the wheel, did not stop in time and hit Dana Ireland. As he said, the Schweitzers left the car, loaded her into the trunk in front, and continued driving. After a few miles, they stopped and pulled Dana out of the vehicle. She was still alive. Pauline stated that, unlike the Schweitzer brothers, he did not become intimate with the victim. And yet, he still said something that brought severe consequences. He said that Ian Schweitzer insisted that he find a tire iron and hit the victim on the head to end her suffering. After that, allegedly, they got back into the car and drove away. All his testimony was on paper, and Pauline signed a statement stating that he testified of his own free will. No one forced him or promised anything, and he was not under the influence of illegal substances or alcohol. After Pauline started cooperating with the police, he was transferred to the Maui Community Correctional Center for his protection. As prison officials said, he was a problem for management and received threats from other inmates. In July 1996, just over 2 years after Gonsalves gave his statement to the police, Frank Pauline retracted his story, saying he made it up because his stepbrother asked him to help him avoid jail. He said he wasn't present at the time of the attack, but still had information about who was responsible for it. According to him, he confessed he was there only because it was the only way to make them believe him. "And my brother telling me the worst thing that can happen to you is they go and give you perjury," Pauline said. However, perjury wasn't among the crimes they accused him of on July 30th, 1997. He was charged with taking the life of Dana Ireland, as he signed a confession stating that he hit her on the head with a tire iron. Later that year, the Schweitzer brothers also received charges. They denied their involvement in the case, stating they had been with their family on December 24th, 1991. It is worth mentioning that the police had reason to believe that Pauline lied when he said he participated in the crime with the Schweitzer brothers. After all, when investigators took him to the Big Island, he could show neither the exact place where they hit Dana nor where people later found her. And yet Pauline signed the confession, which resulted in charges against him. Realizing that his stepbrother was wrong, saying that perjury was the only thing he could get accused of, he retracted his confession. Meanwhile, Gonsalves adhered to the script. Hence, the police dropped the main charges of illegal substance conspiracy against him. He testified against his half-brother Frank Pauline at the trial. At that time, DNA testing technology was not as advanced as it is now. Shortly after the arrest, the authorities collected DNA samples of Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers. The Hawaii County Prosecutor's Office also checked biological fluids from the gurney sheet used the day they took Dana Ireland to the hospital and swabs from her body. However, the police were startled when they received a report saying that the DNA of Frank Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers did not match the DNA of the criminal. Based on these results, they dropped the charges against these three men. And yet, it didn't prevent the investigation from continuing their prosecution. They just stated that someone else must be involved in this. Besides, other evidence also didn't point to these three men. The teeth prints of the Schweitzer brothers and Pauline did not match what investigators believe was a bite mark on the victim's chest. The police found no traces of Dana Ireland's blood or hair in Albert Ian Schweitzer's Volkswagen, a car that became his property only a month after her death. Perhaps pressure from the Ireland family, the public, and the press played a role in the further development of events. Albert Ian Schweitzer was 20 years old at the time of Dana Ireland's death. The only thing he had on his criminal record was related to traffic violations, such as resisting an order to pull over and racing on the roadway. Sean Schweitzer was 16 years old when Dana died. When the brothers received charges related to the Ireland case, Sean was already 23 years old. At that time, the police also charged him with fourth-degree assault in an unrelated case, namely inappropriately touching a girl. For the latter case, he received a sentence of 180 days in prison and 1 year of probation. At the time of the incident, the girl was 15, and Sean was 16. Thus, although the DNA test was negative, all three suspects involved in Dana Ireland's death violated the law at some point. It, of course, didn't help to clear their names. 5 days after Frank Pauline made his first statement to the police, investigators raided the Schweitzer family home. They took Ian's 1957 Volkswagen Beetle as evidence. Both brothers told the police they weren't with Frank Pauline, although they knew him. Sean said he was at home that Christmas Eve, and Ian said he was either at home or at his uncle's house. Ian also told the police how he got his car. Firstly, Ian denied doing any bodywork with the vehicle. When he first got the car, it was purple, but since it wasn't his color, he decided to repaint it yellow. Schweitzer's lawyers believed Frank Pauline accused the brothers because of the enmity between their families. Despite all that, the prosecutors continued to move forward. On May 5, 1999, a few days before the statute of limitations on some crimes committed against Dana Ireland, the police received what they thought was another breakthrough in the case. They received the statement from a prisoner named Michael Ortiz. Being an accomplice of Gonsalves, he was in the same cell with the Schweitzers before the police dropped charges against them. In conversations with the authorities, Ortiz claimed that Albert Ian Schweitzer confessed to him what he had done. Based on Ortiz's testimony, just 2 weeks later, Frank Pauline and the Schweitzer brothers were again charged in the Dana Ireland case. After this, some people had suspicions and distrust of the authorities. After all, they received information from a questionable source just a few days before the statute of limitations ran out. It seemed too convenient. Frank Pauline was the first to appear in court. The trial was very emotional. Pauline insisted on his innocence, telling the court that he had lied when he confessed his involvement in Dana's death. On the witness stand, Mary Ireland recalled getting that first call about what had happened to her daughter. She said something awful has happened. She said there's a bicycle in the road, a shoe and hair, Ireland recounted. But the witnesses who linked Pauline to the crime had questionable backgrounds, and some had a lot to gain by pointing the finger. Among those who benefited from Pauline being found guilty was his half-brother Gonsalves, who became a witness for the prosecution. Witness William Chung, who also testified against Pauline, said Frank confessed his involvement in this crime. However, when asked if he saw Pauline in the courtroom, he pointed to another person, although Frank Pauline was there. The jury also saw Dana Ireland's bike, shorts, top, underwear, and a Jimmy's t-shirt recovered from the scene. Not one of those items had DNA from Pauline or the Schweitzers. To get around the lack of scientific evidence, Deputy Prosecutor Lincoln Ashida insisted that the Jimmy's t-shirt, covered in Dana Ireland's blood, belonged to Pauline. "We're not afraid of that evidence, we embrace it," Ashida said then. That same DNA technology works both ways, for the defense and the prosecution. Pauline's lawyer protested, saying the t-shirt wasn't even Frank's size. Nevertheless, the jury found that the evidence and assumptions presented at the trial were enough to convict Pauline. Despite forensic evidence showing that Pauline gave a false confession, he was found guilty and sentenced to 180 years. The next was the trial of Albert Ian Schweitzer. He knew that despite the lack of any physical evidence, Frank Pauline had been sentenced to 180 years in prison. Therefore, Schweitzer was surprised when prosecutors offered him to take a plea deal. However, he refused it, continuing to insist on his innocence. The prosecutor claimed that Schweitzer's Volkswagen Beetle was the car that hit Dana and then took her to a fishing trail where she was found. All this happened despite several facts. Firstly, in the area where they found Dana, witnesses saw another car, a pickup truck. Secondly, analysis of Schweitzer's car did not show any evidence of his involvement in this case, and Ian became the official owner of Volkswagen only in January 1992. In 2000, based on the statement of Michael Ortiz, who claimed he heard Schweitzer's confession, and the allegedly unusual circumstance of scratches on the bumper of his car, Ian Schweitzer was sentenced to 130 years in prison. After seeing his older brother convicted, Sean Schweitzer took a plea deal. He and his family changed their minds and decided not to insist on his innocence, fearing the justice system would fail them again. In the end, Sean Schweitzer pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of kidnapping and involuntary deprivation of life. Part of the deal with the prosecutor's office was that Sean Schweitzer had to accuse his brother and Frank Pauline of Dana's death and take a polygraph test to show he was honest when confessing to the crime and reporting the details. On March 24, 2000, a polygraph examiner from the State Attorney General's office administered the test. As the court documents indicated, when taking the test, Sean Schweitzer wasn't truthful when describing what happened. In other words, he lied about his involvement in the death of Dana Ireland. However, while he didn't pass the test, he still received an offer to take the plea deal. And here's why. Deputy Prosecutor Lincoln Ashita gave the judge a different statement. According to court transcripts, Ashita said Schweitzer did pass the polygraph, finding that he was not deceptive to any of the questions. Sean Schweitzer was sentenced to 5 years probation with credit for time served, 18 months. In an interview Sean gave to Hawaii News Now after his release, he said the deal with the prosecutor's office was a family decision. His brother Ian, the one sentenced to 130 years, later recalled how he thought it was pointless to imprison both brothers. Ian said losing both sons would be even more stressful for his parents, and they would not survive it. He approved the family's decision and told Sean to do what the prosecutor said to avoid spending the rest of his life in prison. Sean still feels remorseful for making the deal and testifying against his brother. And as the months and years passed, he and his family also struggled with the stain left by this case. "I went through many years of disappointment, had hard time to find a job," Sean Schweitzer said, adding that community members made remarks about the case for years after. Dana's father, John, died in 2000 at 76. After the death of his daughter, he became an advocate for the rights of crime victims. He also worked on the adoption of a law concerning the statute of limitations for violent crimes. Ian Schweitzer and his family did not accept his wrongful conviction and continued to fight. In 2005, Ian Schweitzer applied for a case review from the Innocence Project. 5 years later, in 2010, work on this project started gaining momentum. Law students at the University of Hawaii, lawyers and professors studied old documents related to the investigation of the Dana Ireland case. The prosecutors of Hawaii County let them do their job. They allowed the Innocence Project to review the case to determine if the wrong people were convicted. Year after year passed, but the work to achieve justice did not stop. Dana's mother, Mary Louise Crank Ireland, died on October 10, 2016, at 92. During the many years Ian Schweitzer spent in prison, his parents tried to visit him as often as they could. However, the visits stopped as soon as he was transferred from prison in Hawaii to Saguaro in Eloy, Arizona. The long flight and the protracted drive from Phoenix were challenging for them, and especially for Linda Schweitzer, who was fighting breast cancer those days. That one time in the Arizona prison, her son said something to her that still stings. He said, "Mom, don't come back, because I don't want to watch you walk away from me again." On January 23, 2023, 23 years after the jury found Albert Ian Schweitzer guilty, his legal team filed a motion asking the judge to vacate the conviction based on new evidence and information. The court hearing occurred the next day. A few hours after Ian's team filed the motion, a state deputy sheriff took Schweitzer from Arizona's Saguaro Correctional Center and escorted him on several flights to Hilo. They reached it in time for the hearing. After a long night at the hotel, his family gathered at the Hilo courthouse the following morning. They were anxious to see Ian Schweitzer, who had only arrived on the island hours earlier. Dressed in an aloha shirt provided by his legal team, Schweitzer smiled when he appeared in the courtroom. His legal team presented new evidence to the court. DNA expert Nancy Din was one of those who testified at the trial. They tested all the items again using advanced methods unavailable during the original trials. The technology, it got better, Din explained. It got improved in a sense that we can now see things that we could not see before. In 2000, authorities said there was too much Dana Ireland's blood on the t-shirt. stating it as a reason they did not find any DNA of Frank Pauline or the Schweitzer brothers on it. However, scientists who studied the evidence of the Innocence Project distinguished Dana Ireland's DNA from other DNA found on the T-shirt using modern technology. They also found seminal fluid and sweat from the armpit on it. DNA expert Nancy Dinh testified that the DNA found on the T-shirt and Dana's body belonged to the same person. But this person was neither Frank Pauline nor one of the Schweitzer brothers. After Dinh's statement, a tire tread expert gave remote testimony, telling the court that Schweitzer's Volkswagen could not have left tracks found at both crime scenes. In his opinion, a larger vehicle, a truck, SUV, or van left those tracks. Dentist Adam Freeman was the last to testify. Ireland had an injury on her left breast, which, according to the initial opinion of the prosecutors, was a human bite mark. But Freeman said it wasn't a bite mark. This particular case is a poster child for bad forensic sciences where bite marks are flawed, he testified. Late in the evening, the witnesses finished testifying, after which District Court Judge Peter Kubota announced his verdict. The new DNA evidence, the tire tread evidence, the bite mark evidence, and Sean Schweitzer's recantation conclusively proves that in a new trial, a jury would likely reach a different verdict of acquittal, Kubota told the court. So therefore, the conviction of Albert Ian Schweitzer is hereby vacated, and Mr. Schweitzer shall be released immediately from custody. With those words, coming 23 years after a jury found him guilty and 25 after he got arrested, Ian Schweitzer was suddenly a free man. Next, the judge addressed Ian Schweitzer with moving words. You got 1/3 of your life ahead of you. You can live it being angry and resentful at the process or the people that put you there, or you can live it with a new freedom, Kubota said. I suggest that since you have your whole family here, you hug and love your family and live a fulfilled life and make the best of the next 1/3 of your life. Freed from the handcuffs, Schweitzer first hugged his lawyers and then his family members, some of whom he had not seen for decades. His mother was crying in his arms. Ian's son, who was very young when his father went to prison, was present in the courtroom too. They shared a hug. His younger brother Sean was also there with a smile and open arms. After the acquittal of Ian, his brother Sean's lawyer is also seeking to have his criminal record cleared. Frank Pauline died in prison in New Mexico in 2015. On April 27, 2015, an inmate, Daniel Hood, who is serving time for taking the lives of 2 people, attacked Frank Pauline, hitting him 3 times on the back of the head with a rock when they were all in the recreation yard at the Southern New Mexico Correctional Facility in Las Cruces. They were cellmates. Hood attacked Pauline because he considered him a snitch. The medical staff of the prison could not save Pauline. His family's lawyer plans to file a petition for his posthumous rehabilitation. As for Ian Schweitzer, he says that the transition from a prisoner to a free person is an arduous process. Adjusting to life outside the prison walls is more challenging than he expected. He says he fights with anxiety most of the days. Schweitzer may be entitled to compensation for wrongful imprisonment, which allows rehabilitated persons to receive $50,000 for each year spent in prison. However, it is not an easy process, but his lawyers are working to ensure he receives compensation. 3 decades later, the Dana Ireland case remains open, and the investigators hope that new methods of DNA testing and genealogy will allow them to find the person who destroyed the life of the Ireland family.